Hi everyone, welcome to my channel where I share knowledge on various topics. And if you've not subscribed already, please hit the subscribe button and then click the notification bell so you don't miss any of my future videos. In this presentation, I'm going to talk about conducting scientific research as a student, and my focus is going to be on the first chapter, which actually describes the introduction of your research report. And my presentation will have the following outline. First, I'm going to talk about the introduction. Then I'm going to talk about the components of the introduction. Then I will also talk about placing the introduction and everything within a bigger context. Then I'll summarize the presentation. So let's get started. Usually in your report, the introduction generally gives the background information or some broad overview, of your research work, more like a bird's eye view of your research work, such that anyone who takes your report to read the introduction should have a fair idea, as to whether your work is relevant, to the global community or not, and should also have a fair idea as to what you actually did and why you actually set off to do that particular kind of research. And usually the introduction actually has several components, which must feature for most institutions across the world. First, there should be a background information, and then there should be a problem statement, then there should be objectives, then there should be justification and relevance, then there should also be the organization of your report. So basically, for the overview or the background information, here you place your research in context and you talk about the general problems that exist at a global level, and you try to narrow it down to try to make a case for your research, and how your research actually fits, into the global context, and how it is important, to be a part or to be a solution to a problem, or to be a part solution to the problem. So after the background information, the problem statement actually gives you the chance to actually dig much deeper into the kind of problem that the research is actually solving. You must describe your problem in detail, and the description of the problem must be convincing, such that anyone who takes it and reads it must be convinced that indeed there is a problem, and your work seeks to solve or resolve that particular problem, either in full or in part. Then for the objectives, here you state the main purpose of your work, or you state what you're going to do, basically the main aim of your work. And typically for most universities around the world, you have a required number of objectives that you're supposed to have, which may be either 2, 3, 4 or 5. The higher objectives actually go further up into the study. If you're studying for, let's say, a master's degree course, or some PhD, then you may be required to have more objectives. But if you're studying on a lower degree level or at a diploma level, you may be required to have a lower number of objectives. Then for the justification and relevance, here what you're going to do is that you actually explain the importance of your work to the global scientific community, or to the globe. Basically, you explain why it is important and why your work is relevant, and why your objectives will be adequate in actually resolving the problem that you've actually stated or you've actually described. So basically, you're convincing the readers in your reports that your work is important, that they should pay attention to it. And then for the organizational report, here you just present a summary of the content of the project report to help the reader, so that if the reader is interested in some aspect of your work, they can actually use this particular section to go right there, to which particular chapter is of interest to them in your work. And when you put everything together, the background information, your problem statement, objectives, justification, and organizational report, all these together gives the reader a bird's eye view of your research work, so that the reader can actually understand what your objective is, what you set out to do, and the reason why you set out to do, and the kind of problem that your work seeks to resolve, at a global level or at a local level. So for your introduction, the most important component in the introduction is the problem statement, because it is the foundation of the research. It is where the research actually begins, because every research sets out to solve a problem. So before you embark on the research, the problem must be defined, and this is done in the problem statement. So for every research, or for any research, that is the foundation, the problem statement, and that is actually the true beginning of the research. So here you describe whatever problem is there that you seek to solve, and the problem must be described in detail. It must be convincing. You must be able to explain the details of the problem, and why it is a problem that needs a solution. Then once your problem is fully described, and then you have firmly established what the problem is, then you lay down your research objectives to tackle the problem. The objectives must be related to the problem. So the objectives actually are laid out to tackle or to try to resolve the problem that you have actually described. And your objectives typically must be quantifiable and measurable. There must be something that can be scientifically measured, so that it doesn't become something ambiguous. So typically you may have 4 or 5 specific objectives, depending on the level of study where you are, whether you are at the first degree level or at a master's degree level, or even at the PhD level, basically. But the higher you go in level, the more objectives you'll be required to have. So all these objectives must be things we can measure. So for instance, if you set off to design some specific components, of a machine to solve a particular problem, at the end of the day, we must be able to determine that indeed you were able to design those components. We must be able to measure that indeed the components were there, they were successful, and they're able to function the way they're supposed to be, basically. So when you're setting objectives, it's very important that your objectives must be clear. It must be something that can be measured, but not something that is left to the discretion of someone. No, that one is it's not a good thing to do in scientific work. So after the objectives are set out, you present your justification, and the relevance of your research to actually establish how important your objectives are in resolving the problem. So your justification must be able to explain that your objectives are good and are relevant, and they can actually help or lead up, to resolving the problems that you have described, in your problem statement. And once you're able to resolve this problem, your solution, how important is your solution, to the global scientific community? All these things you describe under the justification, and then the research relevance. And the overview of the background information, which is typically the first thing you write in your introduction, is something to place your research within the global context. So there you give a brief description of what the global issues are, what the problems are, basically. And then you narrow it down to your research work and what exactly your research work is about, and how it can fit into any of the solutions to actually solve these global problems. And typically your overview of background information will typically be just one page, one page with multiple paragraphs in there. And then the last aspect of your first chapter, which is the report organization, also explains the content of your report and how they are arranged. So there you describe how each section or each chapter of your report is arranged. So you can see maybe chapter 1, basically talks about these and this and these. Chapter 2 talks about your literature review and whatever it is. Chapter 3, based on how you've organized your work, you give in one simple paragraph, you give a brief description that actually gives an overview of how your chapters are arranged, how the information progresses from one chapter to the other. So for most universities around the world, or most institutions of higher learning around the world, the requirements will not be too different from what has been presented here. Even if there will be variations in what I've presented here, there will be very minor variations. So within your introduction must be organized in such a way that the information inside is placed in a global context of problems and solutions. Mind you, the main aim or the main objective of the research is to resolve a problem. The problem may be a global problem, or it may be a local problem. So in your introduction, everything combined must be able to place your work within the global context, and must be able to establish the relevance of your work, and must be able to explain that indeed your work is the solution to a certain problem, or is one of the solutions to a certain problem, or your work contributes to some solution to some global or local problem. And the potential contribution of your research work, to the global knowledge base must also be established in introduction, because you are doing the research, you are going to be generating some new ideas, and these ideas, are going to be new knowledge, something, that other people may have to learn anew, so you must be able to hit on this particular element, that indeed your research is relevant, and what has been generated in your work actually makes a meaningful contribution to the global knowledge base, which actually leads up to a solution, or which actually leads up, or which is actually the solution, in any way is acceptable, basically. So you must be able to establish this also in your introduction. And once your reader takes your introduction and reads, your introduction should be able to convince the reader that your research is a solution, or is part of a solution, or is part solution to a main global problem, or the problem could be a local problem. If you say global problem, it may be a problem facing the world at large, things like climate change, let's say agriculture, food, post-harvest losses, and whatever it is. Or the problem may be a local problem, something affecting, let's say, a country, like the power generation of a country, or the establishment of some irrigation system for some small community. These are local problems. So either way, you must be able to convince the reader that whatever it is that you're working on is a solution, or is part of some solution to some problem, basically. And again, you must be able to convince the reader in your write-up or in your research that your work is important to the world. The world needs the results of your work to feed into the bigger picture of solutions, and your work is important to the work at both the small scale and also at the large scale. You must be able to demonstrate this, in your introduction, that indeed your work is important to the world. And for an introduction, the key to writing a good introduction is to have knowledge, basically. And to have the relevant knowledge, you must study, and you must be able to read wide. There is no other way. So in summary, your introduction, in your research report would generally give a background information and a broad overview of your research work, what exactly you're working on, what problem are you resolving, and why it is even important that you're embarking on that particular research. An introduction, or in your introduction, various things are described, such as the overview of background information, your problem statement, or what problem your work is resolving, your objectives, what exactly you're doing, the justification as to how important is your work, to the global scientific community, and a report organization, which will also talk about how your report has been organized, and arranged and placed in the report. And the main important component of the introduction is the problem statement, because it is the foundation of the research. It is where the work actually begins from. Every research sets out to solve a problem. So your problem statement is the first point, and you must pay critical attention to that, and you must be able to pin and hammer down what particular problem you are resolving. And your objectives also in introduction detail which aspects of the problem you have decided to focus on. So exactly what you intend to do about the problem, or what you've done about the problem in your research, basically. And together, once you put everything together, your introduction must be able to convince the reader that your research is important to the global scientific community, that your research is a solution to some global or local problem, or your research is a contribution to the series of solutions to some local or global problem. So at this point, I'd like to thank you for making the time to watch my presentation. Please like, share, and subscribe to my channel. Thank you.